The courtroom went silent the moment Martin Calloway walked through the doors. He was not supposed to be there, not dressed like that. Gray maintenance uniform, scuffed steel-toe boots, a lanyard still clipped to his chest from the building 3 blocks over where he'd been mopping floors since 4 in the morning. He carried no briefcase. He had no assistant. He had nothing except a manila folder tucked under one arm and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to men who have spent years learning how to disappear. The bailiff moved toward him. The judge looked up from her papers, and Noelle Hargrove, seated at the defendant's table in a blazer she had borrowed from her paralegal because no one had thought to bring her anything better, turned around and saw him standing there, and did not know whether to feel relieved or afraid. She had never seen this man before in her life. 3 weeks earlier, Noelle Hargrove had been the kind of woman whose name appeared in the business section, not the crime column. 41 years old, founder and CEO of Viridian Systems, a clean tech firm she had built from a patent and a rented garage in Cincinnati into a company valued at just under $2 billion. Her technology, a modular carbon capture unit small enough to install on existing industrial stacks, had been called by people who understood these things one of the most consequential environmental innovations of the decade. She had also, according to a federal indictment filed on a Tuesday morning, committed wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct a regulatory investigation. The charges were precise. The evidence as presented to the press looked damning, and the law firm she had retained, Aldridge, Peel & Moore, 40 attorneys, 3 floors of a downtown Columbus high-rise, a retainer that had cost her more than most people earned in a year, had spent 6 weeks assuring her they had everything under control. They did not have everything under control. What they had, as Noelle would learn later, was a phone call. One phone call, placed from a private number to the senior partner's personal line, 3 days before the trial was scheduled to begin. The details of that call were never fully established in court. What was established, because the billing records made it undeniable, was that Aldridge, Peel & Moore submitted their final invoice on a Thursday and filed their motion to withdraw on a Friday morning. 1 business day before trial, the judge, a measured woman named Constance Birch, who had been on the federal bench for 19 years and had seen nearly everything, denied the motion with language that was, for a judicial ruling, unusually direct. She called it an abuse of process. She noted that withdrawal at this stage would cause severe prejudice to the defendant. She ordered the trial to proceed as scheduled, and so Noelle Hargrove sat at the defendant's table alone, with a paralegal who was not licensed to speak, and a folder of documents she did not fully understand, and waited for something to happen. Something happened. It just wasn't what anyone expected. Martin Calloway had worked the night shift at the Vance Federal Courthouse for 11 years. He knew the building the way a person knows a house they have lived in too long, not consciously, but in the body. He knew which elevator stuck between 2 and 3. He knew that the 3rd-floor men's room had a leak behind the 2nd stall that facilities had been ignoring since 2019. He knew that Judge Birch took her coffee with 1 sugar and that she arrived 40 minutes before anyone else, and that on the mornings before big trials, she stood at the window in her chambers and looked out at the parking garage for a long time before she put on her robe. He was not supposed to know any of this. He was the night custodian. He was supposed to be invisible. Martin was 53 years old. He had a daughter named Iris who was 9 and who believed, without reservation, that her father was the smartest person alive. He drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked passenger mirror and ate the same lunch every day, a turkey sandwich and an apple, because it was easier than deciding. He lived quietly. He asked for very little. What almost no one knew, what Martin had not told a single person in 11 years of working that courthouse, was that he had passed the Ohio bar exam at 26, practiced corporate litigation for 14 years, made partner at 38, and walked away from all of it the week after his wife's funeral. Her name had been Dana. She had died of a stroke at 39, which was the kind of thing that rearranged a person's understanding of what mattered. He had gone back to his desk after the burial and looked at the files stacked on his credenza and felt nothing. Not grief exactly. Grief was too sharp a word for what he felt. It was more like the sudden awareness that he had been building something for years without ever asking whether it was worth building. He had given his notice the following Monday. He had moved back to Columbus, closer to Dana's mother, who helped with Iris. He had found the courthouse job through a posting on a community board, and he had taken it, and he had stayed. He told himself it was temporary. That was 11 years ago. He saw Noelle Hargrove for the first time on a Wednesday evening, 3 days before her trial was scheduled to begin. He was running a buffer along the third-floor corridor when she came out of the records room, carrying more than she could reasonably hold. 3 accordion folders, a laptop bag, a cardboard box that was slowly losing its structural integrity. She made it approximately 8 feet before the box gave way entirely and 40 pages of financial exhibits scattered across the freshly waxed floor. She did not say anything. She just stood there for a moment, looking at the paper, and Martin could see, from where he stood, from 11 years of watching people in this building carry things they could barely hold, that she was not far from the edge of something. He set down the buffer and walked over. He did not say anything either, at first. He just picked up the pages. He stacked them carefully, checking the numbered corners to keep them in order, which he did automatically and without thinking. She noticed that. He could tell by the way she looked at him. "Thank you," she said. "Third-floor copy room has a cart," he said. "Down the hall. Second door. You can borrow it." She looked at the pile of papers in his hands. "You put them back in order." They were numbered. Most people wouldn't have noticed. He handed her the stack and picked up the box. He walked with her to the elevator without being asked, because the box was still not going to survive unassisted, and when they reached her car in the lower garage, he helped her load everything in the trunk. She thanked him again. He nodded. He did not tell her he had spent 14 years handling cases not unlike hers. He did not tell her he recognized the exhibit numbering system, or that he had, from a single glance at the top page, already identified what appeared to be a significant gap in the prosecution's disclosure timeline. He went back upstairs and finished buffing the floor. But he thought about it for the rest of the shift. By 11 o'clock that night, Martin Calloway was sitting at the small desk in his kitchen. The same desk where Iris did her homework, still scattered with colored pencils and a half-finished drawing of a horse, with his reading glasses on and his phone open to the federal court's public docket. He told himself he was just looking. It was public record. He wasn't doing anything. He read for 4 hours. The indictment was built on 3 pillars, a series of internal communications, allegedly showing that Noelle had knowingly misrepresented Viridian's carbon capture efficiency data to investors, a set of wire transfers that the prosecution characterized as payments to suppress an independent audit, and the testimony of a former Viridian CFO named Douglas Crane, who had agreed to cooperate with federal investigators. Martin read the exhibits twice. Then he read them a third time, more slowly. The wire transfers were dated, the internal communications were dated, and Douglas Crane, according to the cooperation agreement filed in the public record, had provided his first formal statement to investigators 8 months ago. Martin took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The problem, the significant structural problem that he could see as clearly as he could see the pile of Iris's colored pencils, was that 2 of the internal communications the prosecution was using as their cornerstone evidence had been authored, according to the metadata embedded in the document file names after Douglas Crane had already begun cooperating. The dates didn't align. They couldn't align. Either the documents had been created retroactively, which would mean they were fabricated, or they had been misstated in the disclosure, which would mean the prosecution had either made a catastrophic error or was hoping no one would check. Martin sat with that for a long time. Iris was asleep down the hall. The house was quiet. He could hear the refrigerator running and, faintly, a dog barking somewhere on the street. He put his glasses back on and kept reading. He did not go to the courthouse the next day. He used a personal day, the first he had taken in 2 years, and he drove to the public library on Oak Street, where he spent 6 hours using the research databases to pull every piece of publicly available documentation related to Viridian Systems, the regulatory investigation, and Douglas Crane's professional history. What he found on the 3rd hour was a connection he had not been looking for. Douglas Crane had left Viridian 14 months ago, under terms that had been described in the industry press as a mutual and amicable separation. What the press had not reported, because it was buried in an arbitration filing that had been settled confidentially, was that Crane had filed a wrongful termination claim against Viridian 2 weeks after his departure. The claim had been settled. The terms were sealed. A man who believed he had been wrongfully fired. A man who then became the government's primary cooperating witness against the person who fired him. Martin wrote that down. He also found, in a trade publication from 8 years ago, an interview with a venture capital firm called Harwick Capital Partners. Harwick Capital had made 3 significant investments in the past decade, all in energy technology companies that had subsequently been acquired by a single larger entity, a privately held conglomerate called Dresser Industrial Group. Viridian's largest competitor was a subsidiary of Dresser Industrial Group. Martin sat back in the library chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he wrote that down too. The morning of the trial, he woke at 4 as usual, made coffee, checked on Iris, and sat at the kitchen desk until 5:30. He had the manila folder in front of him. Inside was 11 pages of notes, printed copies of the documents he had found, and a single sheet he had written out by hand, a timeline in 2 columns showing where the prosecution's evidence and the actual record diverged. He had not practiced law in 11 years. He was also, technically, still a member of the Ohio Bar. He had never formally resigned. He had simply stopped paying his dues, and then it came back to him now with the slightly surreal quality of a forgotten fact. He had paid a lump sum reinstatement fee 4 years ago when the Bar Association sent him a notice, because it had seemed easier than the paperwork required to formally withdraw. He drove Iris to her grandmother's and told her he might be late. "Late for what?" Iris asked. "Work," he said, which was not entirely untrue. He arrived at the courthouse at 8:15. The trial was scheduled for 9. He had not called ahead. He had not told anyone he was coming. He was wearing his maintenance uniform because it was what he owned and because he had not at any point in the past 11 years needed to own anything else. He walked past the security desk because the guards knew him and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and walked into courtroom 3B 7 minutes before the session was called to order. Noel Hargrove looked at him from the defendant's table with an expression he recognized, the particular look of a person who has been holding themselves together through sheer willpower and is no longer entirely sure how much longer they can manage it. He sat down in the chair beside her, set the folder on the table, and said quietly, "My name is Martin Calloway. I'm a member of the Ohio Bar. I believe I can help you." She stared at him. "You're the man from the hallway," she said. "With the cart." "Yes, you're wearing a maintenance uniform. I know. It's 9 o'clock in the morning and my trial starts in 7 minutes. I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. The courtroom was filling around them. The prosecution team arranging their materials, the press gallery settling in, the bailiff taking his position near the door. "Can you actually help me?" she asked. Not with hope exactly, with something more guarded than hope. "I think so," Martin said, "but I need you to trust me enough to say yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." What happened next was not what anyone in that courtroom had expected to witness on a Thursday morning. Martin Calloway stood when Judge Birch entered, same as everyone else, and when she called the case he walked to the front of the room and introduced himself as counsel for the defendant. Judge Birch looked at him over the top of her reading glasses for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "you are aware that the defendant's previous counsel withdrew as of yesterday." "I am, Your Honor. And you are prepared to proceed today?" "I am." The prosecutor, a sharp, experienced woman named Catherine Voss who had a conviction rate that people mentioned at Bar Association dinners, looked at Martin Calloway with the measured assessment of someone recalibrating quickly. She had been expecting a disaster. She was not certain anymore what she was getting. Judge Birch asked Martin to approach. She reviewed his bar credentials, which were current, and his identification, which was his driver's license and his courthouse employee badge, which produced a reaction in her face that she kept carefully neutral. She asked him 3 procedural questions. He answered all 3 correctly and without hesitation. She nodded once and told him to take his place. Martin did not make an opening statement that changed the room. He was not that kind of lawyer, had never been that kind of lawyer. He was methodical. He was quiet. He asked questions the way a person places chess pieces, not dramatically, but with a precision that only became apparent several moves later. He spent the first morning of the trial doing something that made Catherine Voss subtly uneasy without giving her anything to object to. He listened. He took notes. He asked the prosecution's first witness short, factual questions and let the answers stand without theatrics. It was in the afternoon session, during the examination of a financial analyst the prosecution had called to walk the jury through the wire transfer timeline, that Martin set down his pen and asked, almost conversationally, "You've reviewed the transfer records dated March 11th of last year?" "I have," the analyst said. "And those are Exhibit 14 in the government submission?" "That's correct. Can you tell me what time those transfers were logged?" A pause. "I'd have to check." "Please do." The analyst checked. 2:47 p.m. and 3:12 p.m. Eastern Time? "Yes." Martin nodded. He picked up a document from his folder. "I'd like to introduce Defense Exhibit A, Your Honor, a certified server log from Viridian's financial processing platform, obtained through public records request." He handed copies to the clerk and to Catherine Voss. According to this log, the transfers referenced in Exhibit 14 were initiated from an IP address registered to an office building in downtown Cleveland. "Hargrove, can you confirm whether you were in Cleveland on March 11th? "No," Noelle said from her seat. "I was in Brussels. I have the flight records. We'll enter those as Defense Exhibit B," Martin said. He turned back to the analyst. "Were you aware, when you reviewed the transfer records, that the initiating IP address does not correspond to any device or network associated with Ms. Hargrove or Viridian's executive offices?" The analyst was quiet. "Were you asked to check?" Martin said. The answer, it turned out, was no. It unraveled the way these things do. Not all at once, not in a single cinematic moment, but piece by piece over 2.5 days. Martin Calloway did not raise his voice. He did not pace. He stood at the podium with his folder and his reading glasses and his 11 pages of handwritten notes, and he asked questions that the prosecution had not anticipated because the prosecution had not expected anyone to look this carefully at what they had assembled. The document metadata, the timeline gap, Douglas Crane's sealed arbitration, which Martin introduced through a separate public filing that referenced the same case number, the connection to Drescher Industrial Group, which he established through 3 layers of corporate filings, until the jury had a clear enough picture of who stood to benefit from Viridian's collapse. Douglas Crane, when Martin cross-examined him on the second day, lasted 40 minutes before his account of events began to contradict itself in ways that the jury could hear. Catherine Voss requested a recess, then another. On the morning of the 3rd day, she met with Judge Birch in chambers. The charges were dismissed before lunch. The hallway outside courtroom 3B was briefly chaos. Press, supporters, the particular noise that collects around any verdict that surprises people. Noelle stood in the middle of it with her paralegal and looked like someone who had not yet decided whether to cry. Martin stood slightly to the side, folder under his arm, and waited for the noise to settle. When it did, Noelle walked over to him and said, "I don't know who you are." "You know my name," he said. "You know what I mean." She looked at him carefully. "Why did you do this?" He thought about it for a moment. Not because he didn't know. He had known since 2 o'clock in the morning 3 days ago, sitting at his daughter's desk with the colored pencils pushed to one side, but because the true answer was harder to say than the simple one. "Because the timeline was wrong," he said, "and no one was going to catch it." She shook her head slowly. "That's not why." He was quiet. "You could have sent an anonymous tip," she said. "Filed a bar complaint. Written a letter. You didn't have to walk into that courtroom." He looked past her at the courtroom doors, closed now, the bailiff already turning the lock. "No," he said, "I didn't." What the press reported in the days that followed was the surface version of the story, the custodian lawyer, the surprise defense, the metadata that broke the case. It was a good story. It spread. Martin's phone, which he rarely used and which he had not given his number to anyone, rang 47 times in 3 days. He did not answer. He went back to work on Monday. He had the 4 to midnight shift. He buffed the 3rd floor corridor the way he always did, and he put a new liner in the waste bin outside Judge Birch's chambers, and he ate his turkey sandwich in the break room at 8 o'clock. He had also, sometime around 6 in the evening, received an email from Noelle Hargrove through the Bar Association's contact portal. The only way she had been able to find him. She wanted to meet. She had a proposal. She said it would take 20 minutes of his time. He read it twice. Then he closed his phone and finished his shift. They met at a coffee shop on Broad Street on a Saturday morning. Noelle was already there when he arrived, seated at a corner table with 2 cups and a legal pad. He noticed she had brought a legal pad. He appreciated that. She had done her research. She knew his full history, the partnership at Alderman and Rourke, the years specializing in securities litigation. Dana, she did not make him go over any of it. There are people who need what you did for me, she said, routinely. People who don't have a $2 billion company and still got there. She turned the legal pad so he could see what she'd written. I want to fund a legal defense organization, specializing in complex financial and regulatory cases for defendants who can't access adequate representation. I want you to run it. Martin looked at the legal pad. I'm a custodian, he said. You were a partner at a firm that billed $400 an hour, she said, and you just won a federal case with 11 pages of handwritten notes and a library card. He was quiet for a moment. Iris is in 4th grade, he said. She has a recital in March. The office will have reasonable hours, Noelle said. We can discuss whatever arrangements you need. He looked out the window at Broad Street. It was early, not much traffic. A woman was walking a dog in a red sweater, the dog, not the woman. He watched them for a moment. What would you call it? He asked. That's up to you. He thought about Dana. He thought about the documents he had read at a kitchen desk at 3 in the morning, the particular focus that had come back to him so naturally he had barely noticed it arriving. He thought about Iris asking him what he did for work, and about the answer he had given for 11 years that was true, but not complete. Calloway Legal Aid, he said. Simple. Noelle nodded. Simple works. He did not leave the courthouse job immediately. He finished out the month because he had said he would and because he had always believed that a person should finish what they started. He trained the new night custodian carefully, showed him the elevator trick and the copy room cart and the precise technique for buffing the 3rd-floor corridor without leaving streaks. On his last shift, he stopped outside Judge Birch's chambers on his way out. The building was empty, the lights low. He stood there for a moment in the hallway where he had spent 11 years. And he thought about all the cases he had heard through walls and doors, all the lives that had moved through this building and changed shape inside it. He thought about a woman dropping her papers in a hallway at 7 in the evening and a man who knew how to put things back in order. He turned off the light in the break room. He dropped his badge in the envelope the building manager had given him and left it on the desk. He walked out through the main entrance, past the security desk, and into the parking lot where his 2009 Civic was waiting. He sat in it for a minute before starting the engine. Then he drove home to wake up Iris, who had a soccer game at 9 and who would want him there, and who did not yet know that her father had, after a very long detour, found his way back to where he was supposed to be.